Check that you have all your patterns, your front top, back top, front skirt, back skirt, sleeve facing, welt pocket back, front facing, back facing, and waistband. Swap all your darts on your panels. For the front top, fold the pleats so that they face inwards and baste it down with a 0.5 cm seam allowance at the waist. On the wrong side of the front skirt, mark out the position of the welt pocket. Take the welt pocket interfacing and iron it so that it is centralized to the welt pocket marking. Iron it down. On the welt pocket bag, iron the welt pocket interfacing so that there is a 1 cm gap from the top. Mark the welt pocket opening on both the welt pocket bag and the front of the skirt. Position them together and sew along the rectangle shape. Cut through both layers of fabric following the line indicated on the paper pattern. Push the welt pocket bag through the opening and iron well. Check that the corners are sharp. If not, grab your pair of scissors and cut slightly closer to the stitches. Flip the welt pocket back upwards, iron, and then fold it downwards so that it just covers the opening, and iron well. Flip to the right side and see if the pocket flap is covering the pocket opening. If you're happy and satisfied with it, go ahead and top stitch along the bottom. Flip the pocket bag upwards and iron well. Then overlock the 3 sides. From the right side of the fabric, push away the skirt panel to expose the welt pocket bag. You want to sew 2 cm at the sides and 1 cm from the top, making sure to catch the seam allowances. Sew the front and back panels together at the shoulders and at the sides with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew the sleeve facings together at the short edges with a 1 cm seam allowance. Place the sleeve facing at the sleeves and sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. please check that the overlock seams are facing inwards. Understitch on the sleeve facing panel by flipping open the facing and sewing on the sleeve facing panel close to the seam. Make sure that you're catching the seam allowances below. After understitching, fold it inwards and iron well. You may choose to sew the facing down at the shoulder and at the side seam so that it won't flip open, or you can leave it as is as well. Sew the front and back facing together at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. Mark out the sewing line on the facing. Sew the facing to the neckline with a 1 cm seam allowance. Start and stop your stitches approximately 5 cm or about 3 finger space from the center back. This is to prepare for the zip later on. Grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances to reduce the tension. Check that the V-neck looks sharp. If not, go ahead and trim more into the seam allowances. Open up the facing and sew an understitch on the facing, starting from shoulder and finishing at the other shoulder seam. Make sure that you're catching onto the seam allowances below. Attach the waistband to the top panel with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Flip to the wrong side of the top panel and attach the waistband again at the waist with a 1 cm seam allowance. Fold down both waistband panels and iron well. Sew the front and back skirt together at the sides with a 1 cm seam allowance. Open up the skirt panel and sew it together to the top panel at the waistband with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam. Sew the zip at the center back with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Try to match up at the waistband. Finish the bottom of the zip all the way to the top of the slit opening. At the slit opening, fold in the seam allowances at 1.5 cm and iron it. Top stitch the seam allowances down with a 1 cm seam allowance. Finish up the top of the zip by flipping away the facing. Flip open the zip and match the edge of the facing to the edge of the center back. Then continue the horizontal stitch from where you left off and then a vertical stitch down on the outside of the zip, both with a 1 cm seam allowance. Turn it inside out to check that the zip still works. Then go ahead, turn it back, and then cut the seam allowances to reduce the bulk. Turn it inside out and iron well. For the bottom of the dress, measure 5 cm, fold it up and iron, and then sew with a 4 cm seam allowance. And there you have it, your dress is completed.